All right, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're about to go on this really fascinating journey through the history of international development. We're going to be looking at a massive, literally game-changing shift in how global institutions, governments, and NGOs actually approach poverty and economic growth. Specifically, we're zeroing in on the evolution of gender in development. For decades, the global strategy was basically just to, add women to existing projects and hope for the best. But as we're going to see today, that strategy didn't just fail to work, it actively caused harm. So we're unpacking this incredible transformation from a mindset of simply adding women to a radical rethinking that aims to transform entire power structures from the ground up. I want to kick things off by posing this question directly to you. Why did 50 years of adding women to development projects often make their lives harder? It sounds completely counterintuitive, right? I mean, these interventions were driven by well-intentioned planners, backed by billions of dollars in funding, and the whole goal was to help. Yet, early on, these projects frequently backfired, leaving women way more exhausted and marginalized than they were before the projects even started. Unraveling this mystery is the core of our explainer today. Section 1. The missing half. Development flaws. Okay, so let's set the scene. In the 1950s, right after the Second World War, the global focus was entirely on economic growth and modernization. But planners had a massive blind spot. They were completely blind to women's invisible labor. They just assumed that economic growth would automatically trickle down to everyone. But women's unpaid domestic and agricultural labor wasn't even counted in official statistics. It was like it didn't exist. It wasn't until 1970 the groundbreaking research finally challenged this, which led to the Women in Development, or WID approach, in the early 70s. But as flaws in that model started popping up, the late 70s and 80s brought the Gender and Development, or GAD, paradigm shift. And that shift was ultimately cemented globally at the 1995 Beijing Declaration. The real catalyst for this whole awakening came in 1970. An economist named Esther Boserup published research that absolutely sent shockwaves through the development community. She proved that modernization was absolutely not gender neutral. In fact, the new policies being rolled out were actually pushing women out of the productive roles they had traditionally held, especially in agriculture. Boserup's data forced policymakers to face a super uncomfortable truth. Their trickle-down economic growth wasn't trickling down at all. It was actively harming women. Moving right along to Section 2, Women in Development. The WID approach. So the WID approach, which was rooted in liberal feminism, was a direct response to this marginalization. The idea seems simple enough. Just integrate women into the existing development process by improving their access to resources and jobs. But there's a story about a village handcart that brilliantly illustrates the massive blind spots of this approach. There was a project that introduced handcarts to a village so men could collect firewood, theoretically freeing up the women's time. Good idea, right? Well, in practice, the men used the carts to collect and sell the wood for their own personal profit. The local wood supplies were quickly depleted, and the women were literally forced to walk even further than before just to gather fuel for their own homes. So, why did adding resources to the village make things worse for the women? The answer hits the nail on the head regarding the fatal flaw of WID. It treated women as an isolated target group and completely ignored the existing relationships and power structures between men and women. Think about it. If you add paid work or new tools to a community without addressing a woman's already heavy domestic workload, you're just creating a triple burden. Women were suddenly expected to earn an income while still shouldering all the cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Or, like with the handcarts, the new resources just empowered the men to further monopolize the local economy. Which brings us to Section 3, the GAD paradigm shift. Focusing on power. Now, where WID was based in liberal feminism and just wanted to give women equal access to the economy, the new Gender and Development, or GAD approach, took a completely different angle. Founded in socialist feminist thinking, GAD argued that a lack of economic opportunity wasn't the root of the problem. The actual root was much deeper structural power dynamics. GAD shifted the focus away from looking at women in isolation. Instead, it focused intensely on gender relations, meaning the socially constructed roles and power imbalances between men and women. We can actually see how this academic theory translated into institutional reality if we look at these World Bank definitions. Check out the description of the approaches here. WID viewed the problem as the exclusion of women. They were literally seeing women as the problem to be solved. But GAD completely flips the script. Under GADS, the problem is unequal relations of power between rich and poor and between women and men. GAD recognizes that gender relations are socially constructed. They vary across time and culture, and because of that, they can be changed. Actually, scratch that. It's more like they realize you can't just fix the women, you have to fix the system itself. But to actually make this happen on the ground, development planners needed a brand new toolkit. Enter Caroline Moser. In the 1980s, working at the University of London, she developed the Moser Gender Planning Framework. This was a total game changer because it took all this high-level academic GAD theory and operationalized it into concrete practical tools. Suddenly, planners had a real way to analyze power and design much better projects. One of the most vital concepts in Moser's framework is breaking down what she called the triple role of women in lower income settings. You see, women don't just do productive work for income. They also do reproductive work, like childcare and household maintenance, and community managing activities, like sustaining shared neighborhood resources. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that early planners who only measured productive work were entirely missing 2/3 of the actual labor women were performing. It's no wonder the WID-style projects simply added to women's exhaustion. Section 4, Practical versus Strategic Needs. Needs in development. Moser realized we have to separate needs into two very distinct categories. Practical gender needs are about immediate relief, things like access to clean water, healthcare, or food. Meeting these helps women cope better with their current roles. But strategic gender needs, those are entirely different. These are about power shifts, equal property rights, political representation, freedom from violence. Let's say you install a village water pump. That solves a practical need and definitely eases a daily burden, but it leaves the patriarchal balance of power totally intact. Only strategic interventions actually transform society. A truly transformative project uses practical relief as a stepping stone toward that longer-term structural change. To put that into perspective, take a look at this flowchart from the Pan American Health Organization. It details the steps for a gender diagnosis, and it really forces planners to ask the hard questions. Under gender roles analysis, they have to ask, who does what, how, where? Then under access and control, who has what? Only after mapping out these exact power dynamics do they formulate their objectives. And look right at the bottom, they are explicitly required to ask how the project addresses both practical gender approaches and strategic gender approaches. It's a complete shift from just guessing to actually diagnosing power. And finally, Section 5, Gender Transformative Approaches, Empowerment in Action. A perfect real-world example of this GAD empowerment approach in action is India's Self-Employed Women's Association, or SEWA. SEWA doesn't rely on top-down instructions from outside experts. Instead, it utilizes grassroots leaders, known as Aggiwans, who organize their own communities around health, water conservation, and economic rights. This is empowerment as a process driven by women themselves, strictly on their own terms. It enables collective bargaining and cooperative ownership for some of the most marginalized informal sector workers in the entire country. And the impact of addressing those strategic gender needs is highly visible in India's political reforms. Thanks to sustained advocacy, 33% of seats in India's Panchayati Raj institutions, which are their local self-governments, were legally reserved for women. This is a massive, prime example of a strategic intervention. It doesn't just improve access to a service, it directly shifts political power, securing women a formal, undeniable place in local decision-making. The profound realization at the heart of all this is the core philosophy of what we now call gender transformation. Equality isn't just about forcing women to enter a male domain or simply valuing them equally within a broken system. It's about entirely reshaping the fabric of society. As the literature notes, a gender transformative approach aims not to repair the women or even just change the men, but to transform the systems and structures to emancipate both, creating totally new ways of being and doing for everyone. Which brings us to our final thought. I want to leave you with this provocation. If a development project gives a community clean water, meeting a vital, practical need, but leaves the underlying power structures completely untouched, is it a true success? The shift from WID to GAD teaches us that simply adding marginalized groups to an unequal system doesn't create equality. It challenges all of us to look at our own communities and ask, are we just improving access to resources, or are we actually shifting who gets to make the decisions? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this gives you a powerful new lens for looking at how we build a fairer world.